Hello, students. The subject of today's lesson is what some historians refer to as the Second Industrial Revolution, which is to distinguish it from the First Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century, also referred to as the Market Revolution. And it's fitting that this would be lesson 3 out of 5 because the Industrial Revolution is going to be central to everything that we're talking about when it comes to changes in the late 19th century in America. What we first want to consider is why the United States industrialized and why it industrialized to the level that it did to become one of the foremost economies in the world. One of the most important factors is access to the important raw materials necessary for the Industrial Revolution that the United States already had at its disposal within its own borders. Many European nations that were industrializing prior to or at the same time as the United States had to rely on colonies for many of their raw materials, whereas the U.S. was such a large nation physically and had, as John O'Sullivan put it, overspread the North American continent, that a lot of what we needed was already within our borders. For example, we can see this picture of coal miners. And yes, they are very young. We'll get into why that was a problem in the next topic. They are mining the coal that was necessary for fueling the steam engines, for the trains, for the factories, and later on in the Industrial Revolution for the electrical power plants. America had vast forests they could cut down for timber, for building materials, and which will later be replaced in skyscrapers and bridges and even suspension bridges by steel, which is processed from iron. Oil was another natural resource that the United States had an abundance of, and indeed the U.S. is still one of the largest producers of oil in the world today. In the late 19th century, oil was largely used as a lubricant for the machines or to be processed into kerosene for lighting, and that lighting will later be replaced by electrical lighting. And eventually, the byproduct of this process, gasoline, will be used to fuel internal combustion engines. Cheap labor is another factor that's going to contribute to America's industrialization. We're going to see a sizable amount of immigration to the United States, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Italy, Poland, Russia, Greece, but also from East Asia, particularly China, prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act. In addition, there's a lot of migration within the United States as we have many African Americans moving out of the South after Reconstruction, and a lot of rural to urban migration, people moving out of the country and into the cities because mechanized farming has replaced the need for a lot of farm labor. So you have a lot of men who are looking for work and can't find it in the countryside, and so they're moving to the cities. And these guys are all going to provide a very cheap source of labor and readily available source of labor for the factories. Additionally, there's the free enterprise capitalist economic system of the United States, which encouraged competition, and that competition oftentimes, at least early on, is going to encourage innovation and efficiency so that companies can maximize their profits, which is going to contribute to new innovations and techniques in industrializing and producing products at a much faster rate. The Civil War gives a big boost to all of this innovation too. The demand of the massive armies, particularly that the North was fielding in terms of clothing, shoes, food, guns, ammunition, drove a great demand in northern factories to produce to meet those needs. In post-Civil War, we have seen a lot of innovation to meet those Civil War needs that is going to be applied and continue to be applied. Government policies, on the other hand, are also really, really important. The government in this time period is very, very pro-business. That's one of the key things to remember. Very pro-business in its decision-making. Generally, the U.S. government is seen as having a laissez-faire economic policy, which basically means that they put very, very few regulations on business. Generally, it's referred to as sort of a hands-off approach to the economy, but the U.S. government always has been, and in the late 19th century still was, very hands-on. It was just that it was much more interested in protecting businesses, American businesses, and getting them to grow than it was at protecting, say, American workers or perhaps fair competition. So one of the things that they will do is the United States government will pass what are called protective tariffs. These are very heavy taxes on imports that make products made in other countries so expensive that Americans are generally going to buy the American-made product. And if they're high enough, the American businesses can actually raise their prices and still sell their product because they're going to be less expensive than the taxed foreign products. The other thing that the United States government does is that it maintains patent laws. So all of these technological innovations, but even innovations in production and business ideas can be patented, and the owner of that patent then has sort of the exclusive right to develop and sell that invention or innovation. And this ensures those people coming up with these new ideas that they will profit off of those and aren't as likely to have those ideas stolen from them. Let's just really quickly look at some of the key innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution, primarily looking at the things that are going to have the largest impact on the economy and American society. One of them is the Bessemer process, which is shown in this diagram here that I'll admit I understand about half of what the labels mean in this. But in short, what it does is it uses a blast furnace process to make steel very quickly and inexpensively, mass production of steel. Now, steel is something we've had for, centuries by this point, but they weren't able to produce it on such a large level. And steel is going to be one of the key elements of the Industrial Revolution. It is going to be used to build rails and railroads. It's going to be used to build railroad trestles and suspension bridges. And the steel beam is essential to the skyscraper, which is essential to the growth of the city. And when we get to looking at the growth of the cities in the late 19th century in topic 2, we'll talk a little bit more about why that is important. Other things is the harnessing of electricity for power, the electric power plant, and the electric light bulb. Imagine what it was like before you had the electric light bulb when most of your lighting was done by kerosene lamp. It doesn't shed a lot of light. It's particularly dangerous in factories. Once they have invented a useful incandescent light bulb that they can install in there, factories can start running 24 hours. Many of you guys, your parents probably work in factories, and they work all hours of the day, and that is possible because of electrification and because of the electric light bulb. Mass production and scientific management. These are new techniques. These are more referencing a whole variety of techniques that are designed to heighten efficiency, which means you put less money into producing a product. If you can produce it faster, you've put fewer resources in terms of time into producing that product, which means you can produce more of a product, you can sell more, and you make greater profit off of those things. Improvements in transportation and communication are also going to be essential in the Industrial Revolution. Communication, long-distance communication, such as the telegraph and what will later replace it in the telephone, allows producers to communicate nearly instantaneously with their markets and with the raw materials to make their production more efficient. Same can be said for transportation. And in the late 19th century, as we looked at in the previous lesson about the West, the train is the most important means of long-distance transportation. And that's going to be true throughout the nation, not just in the West. And the train really ties all of these areas together, the raw materials to the production facilities to the markets, and bringing people around the country to produce the raw materials and into the production and so on and so forth is going to be a big contributing factor to this industrialization. And trains in the late 19th century aren't invented. They've been around since the early 19th century. But what we see in the late 19th century is a lot of improvements to the locomotive. Steam engines become much more powerful, so trains can go faster and haul more. Trains become safer with the invention of air brakes, allowing them to stop in shorter distances and making it less likely that they will wreck while trying to stop. Refrigerated cars allow them to produce beef in the West. We talked about all the beef that was being produced by those ranches in the West being shipped to the stockyards in Chicago. Now they could slaughter the beef on site, put it in these refrigerated cars, and send it all around the country. Time zones, as we see in this map here, are also really important. Standardizing time. Each area used to set its own clocks based upon when the sun was directly above them, and that was noon. So you had hundreds, if not more, of times to figure out when you were trying to schedule when trains would be on tracks, because you could have trains going towards each other on the same track, and you needed to know when one had to get off the track to let the other one through. And it caused a lot of wrecks. Standardizing the time so that you only had to worry about 1, 2, 3, 4 time zones really made it much easier to figure out which train was on which track and when. I'd also like to point out on this one, this early map, Ohio was actually in the central time zone then. We're in the eastern time zone today. So how is the Industrial Revolution going to affect the United States and life for Americans? Well, for one, the United States is going to become a major exporter and one of the leading economies in the world as a result of industrialization. On the more individual level, standard of living improves in the United States, even though wages go down, because products can be made much more cheaply through mass production means and the use of machines. Therefore, more Americans can afford more products that they would not have been able to buy prior to this. The other thing is that, like these girls and women in this factory in the picture, most Americans are now going to start working for someone else. And this is sort of the standard way of living today. You go to a job, you get paid by the boss. But in the mid-19th century, most people worked for themselves. You owned a farm, you ran a business, you had a skill that you could trade with. But now you're going to the factory and you're getting paid by the boss, which means you don't own the means of production, you don't own the machines that make this product, and you don't own the product that is made at the end. You are just part of the production process. In addition, as we talked about, cities are going to grow through immigration from other countries and migration within from the countryside. Pollution and environmental issues are going to come up as well. You can see this picture. I believe this picture is actually from England. But there is, of course, air and water pollution from the coal that is used to run these factories and the power plants that produce electricity. There's also going to be a lot of pollution in the waters we talked about in the West from mining and the mining process. But in the late 19th century, what people were more concerned about was the rapid use of natural resources. Industrialization consumes a lot of resources and does it efficiently, which means we're consuming a lot very, very, very fast. And we were quickly depleting our natural resources like timber. Mechanized farming out on the Great Plains is going to also lead to a lot of farmers not having work anymore. As we learned, many of the farms were consolidated into larger farms because of the machinery, and so a lot of these guys ended up in the cities. Finish up by looking at the effects of the Industrial Revolution on the South and this concept of a new South, an attempt to industrialize the South. It made sense to move the factories that produced cotton cloth closer to the raw materials themselves of the cotton. And you can see that here with this picture of sharecroppers picking cotton in the foreground and a textile mill in the background. And there was also an effort to develop the steel industry with some limited success in places like Birmingham. But overall, the South is going to lag behind the North. And they will do this for a few reasons. For one, their workforce comes from the rather poor Southern schools, which means many of them lack the skills for industrial jobs. Another thing is the banks weren't very good in the South to loan money for these factories. There were very few people with a lot of money in the South, and that meant that banks just didn't have as much money to loan out for that. Lastly, there will be a continued reliance on the cotton crop when markets were drying up, and eventually a pest called the boll weevil will destroy a lot of the cotton crop. Take a look at the graphic organizer for this one. The 4 squares at the top represent four things that contributed to industrialization in America. The four at the bottom are all effects of that. In each of those squares, you just want to quickly explain how it led to industrialization or was an effect of it. And in the bubbles on the outside, you want to give examples of that. So for example, natural resources provided raw materials for industries such as coal, and the standard of living improved because of cheap products. I love you. Bye-bye.